Daniel had no clue that his entire world was about to crumble until he overheard a conversation that cut through him with a pain sharper than any betrayal he'd ever imagined. Moments later, he stood there, frozen in place, staring at his wife as she casually perched on his best friend's lap. The smug grin on her face felt like a dagger plunged straight into his chest. That night, the marriage certificate lay in pieces on the floor, and his wedding ring landed at her feet as he walked away from the life he thought he knew. But that moment wasn't the end. It was just the start of Daniel's transformation. Before we dive deeper into the story, drop a comment below to tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you're a fan of gripping stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Daniel and Grace's home was alive with the hum of conversation and laughter as friends and family gathered to celebrate their 12th wedding anniversary. The living room buzzed with the clink of glasses, warm chatter, and cheerful toasts. Grace's dazzling smile seemed to brighten the entire room as she mingled with their guests, while the sounds of their kids playing loudly upstairs with their cousins added to the joyful chaos. It felt picture-perfect, like a scene straight out of a heartwarming family movie. "Daniel, honey, could you grab the wine from the kitchen?" Grace called out over the lively noise, her voice sweet, but her smile just a bit too rehearsed to feel real. "Sure. Give me a second," Daniel responded, weaving through the crowd. He shot her a quick glance as he passed, silently admiring the life they'd built together, unaware that everything was about to come crashing down. As he uncorked the bottle in the kitchen, muffled voices in the hallway caught his attention. He recognized his mother's voice, usually calm, now thick with urgency. Curiosity tugged at him, and he took a few cautious steps toward the doorway, careful to stay unnoticed. "Are you out of your mind?" his mother whispered harshly. "Daniel could walk in any second. You know he could catch you." Daniel froze in place, his pulse thundering in his ears. What was she talking about? Then Grace's voice slithered through the air, dripping with venomous disdain. "Catch us doing what? What's he gonna do? Cry about it?" she scoffed. "He's too spineless to stand up for himself. He's nothing more than a walking wallet. I don't care what that pathetic loser thinks." Each word hit Daniel like a sledgehammer. His throat tightened as he leaned in closer, the weight of shock rooting him to the floor. How long had this been happening? And how was his own mother involved? Confusion and betrayal churned in his chest, but he knew he had to see it with his own eyes. Heart pounding, he stepped into the hallway. His breath caught in his throat at the sight before him. Grace was sprawled casually on Eric's lap, her fingers lazily running through his hair like they didn't have a care in the world. The sight of their nonchalant intimacy twisted the knife even deeper. When Grace turned and saw Daniel standing there, their eyes locked. Instead of guilt or panic, her gaze was filled with bold defiance. Her lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, grow up, loser. Yeah, we're together," she sneered, her voice laced with contempt. "And what are you gonna do about it, huh?" Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. But before he could find the words to respond, Grace's tone darkened further as she leaned in, her voice dripping with venom. "Listen carefully," Grace hissed, her eyes narrowing. "If you even think about divorcing me, you'll never see your kids again. Don't forget that." Eric's face turned as pale as a ghost. He stumbled over his words. Daniel, it's not like that. We didn't mean for." "Shut up," Daniel cut in, his voice steady and cold, sharper than it had ever been. For the first time, his gaze didn't waver. Something inside him had shattered, but from that break, something unshakable was starting to rise. Then Daniel's eyes drifted to his mother, who stood just a few steps away, wringing her hands, her expression etched with guilt and hesitation. The realization slammed into him with brutal force. She'd known. She'd known everything. His voice sliced through the suffocating quiet, sharp and accusing. "You knew, didn't you?" he demanded, his tone rising with every word. "How long, Mom? How long have you been covering for them?" His mother flinched, as though each word was a lash. She shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away from his penetrating stare. "Daniel, It's not what you think, she murmured weakly, her voice trembling. Can we just go back to the party? Don't lie to me. Daniel's voice cracked like thunder, silencing everything around him. The fury boiling within him surged to the surface, searing away years of trust and affection for his mother. Her silence burned deeper than words ever could, leaving no room for denial. He couldn't ignore the truth, not anymore. Reeling from the betrayal, Daniel backed into the kitchen. His mind raced, and each step felt like dragging a boulder uphill. The weight of Grace's infidelity pressed down on him like a leaden shroud. His hands shook as he yanked open a drawer. The sharp scrape of wood against metal cut through the thick silence. There, buried beneath a forgotten stack of papers, was the wedding certificate, the once cherished emblem of their promises and dreams. Now, it felt like a cruel reminder of everything he'd lost. Daniel stared at the delicate script, his name intertwined with hers in ornate lettering. His chest tightened until a bitter laugh forced its way out. This represents everything I thought we had, he muttered, his voice dripping with disbelief and resentment. What a joke! Without hesitation, he gripped the paper and ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the kitchen like a clap of thunder, sharp and final. But Daniel didn't stop. Piece by piece, he shredded the document until it was nothing but a mess of torn promises scattered across the countertop. Then his gaze fell on his wedding ring, catching the light with a mocking glint. The sight of it made his stomach churn. He yanked it off his finger, his hand trembling, and clenched it so tightly it dug into his palm. With determined steps, he marched back into the hallway. Grace and Eric were still there, their hushed conversation dying the moment they saw him. Daniel didn't say a word. He simply flung the ring at Grace's feet. The metallic clink as it hit the floor seemed louder than any argument ever could be. "Congratulations," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You two deserve each other." For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Grace stared at the ring on the floor, then slowly raised her head, a smug smirk curling across her lips. She crossed her arms, tilting her head as if sizing him up. "So what now?" she sneered, her voice slicing through the air. "Are you going to cry? Run away, like you always do?" Daniel didn't rise to the bait. He met her taunting gaze with a calm so cold it felt like ice settling after a raging storm. There was no need to argue. The truth was right there between them, undeniable and permanent, and nothing she said could diminish the depth of her betrayal. Without a backward glance, Daniel turned on his heel and strode past them. The cold night air slapped his face as he stepped outside and pulled the door shut with a resounding slam. His heart pounded, caught in the storm of anger and pain, each battling for control. He had no idea where he was headed. He only knew that anywhere was better than that house, that illusion of a home built on lies. Behind him, Grace's voice floated through the closed door, muffled, but unmistakably smug. Her laughter rang out, sharp and cruel, like a final taunt. But Daniel kept moving, refusing to let her words penetrate the wall he was building inside himself. For the first time in years, a small spark of resolve flickered in his chest. Grace had already taken so much from him, but she wouldn't take his dignity. With every step that carried him farther from the house, the unbearable weight on his shoulders eased just a little. He didn't know what his next move would be, but one thing was crystal clear. He wouldn't let her destroy what was left of his life. The house was almost eerily quiet now, its silence oppressive. Daniel sat alone in his office, the dim glow of his phone screen casting shadows across his face. The images on the screen blurred as he scrolled through them, each swipe cutting deeper into his fractured heart. Photo after photo appeared, snapshots of what he had once believed were moments of genuine happiness. Birthdays, anniversaries, family vacations. In each picture, Grace's smile shone brightly, her arm casually draped over his or wrapped around their children. How had something that seemed so perfect been a lie? The questions echoed in his mind, relentless and unforgiving. His thumb hovered over one picture longer than the rest. It was from their 10th anniversary, taken by the ocean. The two of them stood close, arms wrapped around each other, framed by waves and sunset light. His smile in that photo was unmistakably real, filled with love and pride. But now, as he stared at Grace's face, he saw something he hadn't noticed back then. A subtle detachment in her eyes, a distance hidden behind the tilt of her head and the practiced curve of her lips. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening as emotions swelled inside him. "How did I miss the signs?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath in the stillness. "How did I let it get this far?" Memories flashed in his mind, moments that seemed glaringly obvious now in hindsight. Her late nights out with friends, her dismissive answers whenever he voiced his concerns, the way she'd brushed off his unease about Eric's constant presence in their lives. One memory pierced through the rest like a shard of glass. He'd confronted her once, hesitantly, about how close she seemed to Eric. "You're paranoid," she'd scoffed, her tone dripping with condescension. "Eric's your best friend. Stop acting so insecure." The words echoed now, a bitter mockery of her deceit. Insecure. That was how she'd silenced him, how she'd made him doubt his instincts and question his worth. And he had believed her. He'd convinced himself that his doubts were irrational, that she was right, and he was wrong. It had been easier to trust her than to face the unthinkable truth. A wave of anger surged through him, hot and overwhelming. His hand curled into a tight fist, and before he could stop himself, he slammed it down on the desk. The sharp sting shot up his arm, anchoring him to the present. The sound reverberated through the room, slicing through the suffocating silence. He leaned forward, resting his head in his hands, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. But as the anger began to ebb, something else began to rise, something far more difficult to bear. Resolve settled firmly in Daniel's chest as he slowly lifted his head, his jaw tightening. Sitting there, drowning in self-pity, wasn't going to change anything. Grace's betrayal had already stolen so much from him. He wouldn't let it rob him of his future, too. He owed it to himself and, more importantly, to his children, to fight for what remained of his life and rebuild it. He set his phone down, his fingers steady for the first time that night. The time for reflection had passed. Now was the time for action. No matter how much it hurt, this wasn't the end. It was the start of something new, something stronger. With a deep breath, he sat up straighter in his chair, feeling as though a small but significant weight had lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in hours, a flicker of determination pierced the shadows surrounding him. The next morning, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the contact information for a lawyer he had bookmarked months ago but never imagined he'd need. His fingers hovered over his phone as hesitation gripped him for just a second. Then, with a sharp exhale, he tapped the number and pressed call. The line rang twice before a calm, confident voice answered. "This is Claire Matthews. How can I help you?" Daniel introduced himself, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions raging within him. He recounted the events of the previous night, his words precise and deliberate, though each one felt like a fresh wound. Claire listened intently, her professionalism an unexpected source of comfort in the chaos of his thoughts. When he finished, she responded with a reassuring calm. "Adultery cases can be complicated, Daniel," she began. "But with the evidence you've already gathered, you have a solid foundation. The most important thing right now is protecting your children. We'll make sure Grace can't use them as leverage." Her words felt like a lifeline thrown to him in the middle of a storm. "What do I need to do next?" Daniel asked, already steeling himself for the fight ahead. "Start documenting everything," Claire advised. "Texts, emails, social media activity. Anything that supports your case. If there are receipts or financial records showing inappropriate spending, include those too. And if you have access to security footage, that can be invaluable." Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'll get started right away." Over the next few days, Daniel threw himself into the task with relentless focus. It wasn't easy. Every new piece of evidence felt like another knife twisting in his chest. But he knew it had to be done. The first step was Grace's phone. She had a habit of leaving it charging on the kitchen counter, assuming Daniel was too trusting or too oblivious to snoop. But trust was now a luxury he couldn't afford. One evening, while Grace was upstairs, Daniel seized the chance. His fingers moved swiftly as he scrolled through her messages. And there it was, a trove of damning texts between her and Eric. "I can't wait to see you tonight. He's clueless as always. Thanks to everyone else, I'll just keep living my life. Even if he finds out, what's he gonna do? He's too soft to take action." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened, his jaw clenching at their casual cruelty. Every word felt like a slap in the face. Without hesitating, he forwarded the messages to his own phone, then carefully deleted any sign of his intrusion. Next, he turned to the bank account. Using their shared finances, he traced suspicious transactions, lavish dinners and hotel stays cleverly disguised as work expenses. Each line item painted an undeniable picture of their betrayal. Then came social media. While neither Grace nor Eric had been foolish enough to post incriminating photos, subtle clues surfaced. They had been tagged at matching locations, and the timing of their comments and check-ins now seemed painfully obvious in hindsight. Finally, he checked the home security system, a precaution he'd installed years ago for the family's safety. But as he reviewed the footage, his stomach turned. The recordings showed more than he'd ever wanted to see. Intimate moments between Grace and Eric on nights when Daniel had been working late or out of town stared back at him from the screen like a cruel confirmation of everything he feared. The raw footage was undeniable, a harsh reality he couldn't look away from but could finally wield as a weapon to fight back. The process of gathering evidence was grueling, each new discovery tearing open wounds that had barely begun to heal. But Daniel didn't waver. His pain and anger had hardened into something sharp and purposeful, a clear mission to make sure Grace couldn't manipulate the situation to her advantage, especially when it came to their children. When he met with Claire again, he laid out everything he'd collected. She reviewed the evidence carefully, her expression steady but tinged with approval. "This is strong," she said firmly. "With this, we can make sure you retain custody and that Grace faces real consequences for her actions." For the first time in days, Daniel felt a glimmer of relief. He wasn't powerless. He wasn't alone. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, and while the road ahead would be steep, it was now undeniably clear. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow over a house thick with tension. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly out the window while his coffee sat untouched and cooling beside him. His mind churned with thoughts, but outwardly he was calm. He knew Grace would be coming downstairs soon. It wasn't in her nature to let things remain unresolved, especially when she thought she could twist the narrative in her favor. Sure enough, the sharp click of her heels against the wooden floor broke the silence. Grace entered the kitchen with a calm, deliberate stride. She looked flawless, as if nothing had happened the night before. Her confidence was maddening, a reminder of how deeply she believed she could still control everything. She grabbed a mug from the cabinet, poured herself some coffee, and leaned casually against the counter, watching him with an almost lazy interest. "So," she began, her voice light but laced with irritation, "are we going to talk about your little outburst at the party? Or are you planning to keep sulking?" Daniel didn't respond immediately. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably between them. Finally, he set the mug down and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What's there to talk about?" he asked evenly, his tone calm but detached. Grace rolled her eyes dramatically and let out an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, come on, Daniel. Don't be so childish. Nothing happened with Eric, and honestly, your insecurities are ridiculous. You embarrassed yourself last night. For nothing." Her words, meant to belittle and dismiss him, failed to land. Instead of reacting with anger, Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with unnerving calm. It was a look Grace wasn't accustomed to, one that didn't radiate vulnerability or desperation. "Don't worry, Grace," he said quietly, his voice steady and deliberate. "I'm taking steps to fix that." She paused mid-sip, lowering her mug slowly. There was something about the certainty in his voice that unsettled her, though she quickly tried to mask it with a scoff. "Oh really? And what's that supposed to mean?" Daniel stood, his movements slow and purposeful. He didn't speak right away, just held her gaze as the silence between them stretched long enough for discomfort to creep into her features. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't fully hide it behind her usual mask of indifference. "It means I'm done being blind," he said at last, his voice unwavering. "And I'm done letting you walk all over me. Fixing my insecurities starts with holding people accountable." For a split second, Grace's composure faltered. Her eyes flickered with something. Maybe fear, maybe guilt, before she quickly recovered. "Oh, please," she snapped, her voice sharpening. "Don't act like you're some kind of victim here. You've always been exhausting, Daniel. Constantly overthinking. Always paranoid. You make everything harder than it needs to be." Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile, a reaction that only unnerved her more. "Maybe I was paranoid," he said softly, his gaze steady. "Maybe I was paranoid," Daniel continued, his voice steady and unshaken. "But I was right, and you know it." Grace's expression shifted as though she were caught between disbelief and something softer. Maybe guilt or fear. She stared at him, impressed in spite of herself, her eyes glistening as if tears threatened to fall. But Daniel wasn't finished. Her usual confidence started to crumble as the reality hit her. This wasn't the same Daniel she had grown used to manipulating. Her voice rose slightly, tinged with frustration. "Fine, Daniel. Go ahead, be dramatic. It's not going to change anything." Daniel took a step closer, his calm demeanor like a wall she couldn't shake. "You're right, Grace. It won't change what you've done. But it'll change everything about what I do next." She froze, the smirk slipping from her face for just a moment. She searched his face, looking for the man she had always controlled, the one who would retreat at the slightest push. But he wasn't there anymore. Without another word, Daniel turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone. She gripped her coffee mug tightly, her knuckles whitening. Her carefully crafted world was beginning to tilt, and for the first time, she didn't know how to regain her footing. Upstairs, the faint sound of their children laughing drifted down, a bittersweet reminder of what was truly at stake. As Daniel climbed the stairs, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. The confrontation hadn't shattered him. It had solidified everything he already knew. He wasn't the weak, insecure man she had made him out to be. He'd been a fool for trusting her, yes, but that didn't mean he would let her define his future. With each step, his resolve strengthened. This wasn't just about pride or heartbreak anymore. It was about protecting the life he had built for himself and his children. Grace's manipulations were over. In the days that followed, Daniel worked quietly but with unwavering determination. Every moment Grace wasn't looking, he poured his energy into gathering the evidence Claire had advised him to compile. Each piece of proof felt like another step toward reclaiming control over his life, even as it deepened the ache of betrayal. Late one night, while Grace was out running an errand, Daniel accessed the backup tied to their shared cloud storage. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through the cache of messages, torn between wanting to know the truth and dreading what he might find. His breath caught when he stumbled upon a string of texts between Grace and Eric. Their words stung more than any confrontation ever could. "Eric, he'll never find out. He's too trusting, too soft." Grace, "Even if he did, what's he gonna do? Cry about it?" Daniel stared at the screen, his chest tightening as their casual cruelty seeped in. Their complete disregard for his feelings was devastating. But instead of letting anger consume him, he saved the messages, forwarding them to a secure folder, just as Claire had instructed. Each day, he uncovered more. Bank records revealing extravagant dinners and gifts disguised as business expenses. Home security footage showing Eric arriving late at night and staying for hours when Daniel was out of town. Every new discovery strengthened his case, even as it chipped away at the image of the life he thought he had. Grace, meanwhile, began to notice the change in him. His silence was unnerving. His calm, even more so. She had expected tears, pleading, maybe even a shouting match. But not this. The steadiness in Daniel's demeanor unsettled her, and she began testing him, trying to find cracks in his armor. One evening, as Daniel sat at the dining table, reviewing financial statements, Grace leaned casually against the doorway, arms crossed. Her voice was light, but the sharpness of her words cut through the air. "Whatever you're planning, it won't work," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You don't have the guts." Daniel didn't look up right away. He finished marking a line on the page, folded the papers neatly, and set them aside. Then, finally, he met her gaze, his expression calm, unreadable. "Good night, Grace," he said, his tone steady and measured. Her smirk faltered. For the first time, he saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. She let out a dismissive scoff, turning on her heel and walking away. But Daniel could feel it, the shift. The balance of power between them was changing, and she knew it. He returned to his work, unshaken. Each document, each message, became another piece of a narrative he was piecing together. A story of betrayal and resilience, one step closer to reclaiming his life. Each recording was a piece of a larger puzzle, coming together to tell the full story of Grace's betrayal. Daniel meticulously organized everything, backing up files, creating folders, and taking detailed notes. This wasn't just about winning a court case. It was about making sure Grace couldn't twist the narrative to hurt him, or worse, their children. Despite the emotional toll, Daniel found an unexpected sense of purpose in the process. The work gave him clarity, a way to channel his pain into something constructive. For too long, he'd let Grace's manipulations steer his life. But now the control was shifting. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was planning, strategizing, and preparing for the fight ahead. Each night, he went to bed knowing he was one step closer to freedom, one step closer to rebuilding the life she had tried to destroy. And every time Grace prodded him with snide remarks and taunts, he met her with quiet resolve. He refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. She might have underestimated him before, but that time was over. Daniel wasn't the man she thought he was, and soon, she'd know exactly what he was capable of. The living room, usually lively and warm, was unnervingly silent. Tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Family and friends sat stiffly, exchanging puzzled glances as they waited for Daniel to speak. Grace sat on the couch, her usual confident facade beginning to crack. Eric lingered near the back of the room, shifting uncomfortably. Daniel's mother avoided eye contact altogether, guilt weighing down her gaze. Daniel stood near the TV, calm and composed, though the quiet fire in his eyes was unmistakable. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the small remote in his hand. Taking a slow, steady breath, he scanned the room, meeting the eyes of every person present before speaking. "You all deserve to see the truth," he began, his voice steady but sharp with emotion. "For too long, I've been blind to what's been happening right in front of me. But not anymore." With that, he pressed the button, and the screen flickered to life. The first video began to play, grainy but unmistakable footage from their home security system. The room was deathly silent as Grace and Eric's familiar figures appeared on the screen, their intimate gestures damning. The sound of gasps rippled through the room, followed by hushed whispers of disbelief. Daniel didn't take his eyes off Grace. He watched as the blood drained from her face, her confidence unraveling with every passing second. "Daniel," she started, her voice trembling. This isn't what it looks like. I wasn't thinking straight. It was a mistake." Daniel's composure cracked, fury flashing in his eyes. "A mistake?" he barked, his voice rising. "How long has this been going on, Grace? Months? Years?" Grace's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but she found only judgmental stares. "We were just," she stammered. "Save it." Daniel cut her off, his tone icy. "I have the receipts, the texts, the footage. You didn't just betray me, you mocked me. You made me a fool in front of everyone. And you dragged my mother into it, too." Grace's desperation grew. Her voice rose, desperate now. Think of the kids, Daniel. Please, we can go to counseling. We can fix this. Daniel's laugh was bitter, slicing through her plea like a razor. Fix this? He repeated, his tone filled with disbelief. Don't insult me. You threatened to take the kids from me, to use them as leverage. You don't care about fixing anything. You care about control. He stepped forward, eyes locked on hers. Well, that ends today. You're done. Grace slumped back against the couch, tears streaming down her face. But Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted his focus to Eric, who had been silent through it all, his face flushed with shame. And you, Daniel said, his voice low and lethal. My so-called best friend. How long, Eric? How long have you been laughing behind my back? Pretending to care about me while sneaking around with my wife? Eric stammered, his hands raised defensively. Daniel, it's not what you think. I mean. But Daniel's expression didn't soften. He wasn't there to listen to excuses. He was there to expose the truth. It wasn't like that, man. I didn't mean for it to happen. Eric started, his voice pleading. Don't. Daniel cut him off, his tone final. You're not even worth my anger. The real blow came when Daniel turned to his mother, who was perched at the edge of her seat, her hands trembling in her lap. He looked at her with an unreadable expression, his gaze steady but heavy with disappointment. And you? He said quietly, though the weight of his words struck harder than any shout ever could. You knew, didn't you? You knew the whole time, and you chose her lies over your own son. A deep, painful silence followed, broken only by a low murmur of shifting emotions in the room. His mother's face crumpled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. I thought I was protecting you, Daniel, she whispered, her voice cracking with guilt. I didn't want to see your family fall apart. Daniel's eyes hardened, devoid of warmth. It fell apart the moment you chose to protect them instead of me. The room fell silent again as his words settled over everyone like a heavy fog. Grace's quiet sobs filled the space. Eric hung his head in shame, and his mother's shoulders shook with regret. Daniel pressed the remote, turning off the screen, then stepped back, taking a slow, controlled breath. This is the truth, he said, addressing everyone in the room. You've all seen it now. No more lies. No more manipulation. Grace, Eric, Mom, whatever you thought you could get away with, it's over. With that, Daniel turned and walked toward the door, his steps calm and deliberate. He didn't need their apologies, their excuses, or their explanations. He'd said everything that needed to be said. And for the first time in months, he felt an undeniable sense of peace. The weight of their betrayal was still there, but the power they held over him was gone. He was free. The courtroom was cold and clinical, its stillness broken only by the soft shuffle of papers and whispered exchanges between attorneys. Daniel sat at his table, his posture straight, his face composed with quiet resolve. Across the room, Grace sat beside her lawyer, her once unwavering confidence now replaced with a thin veneer of nervous composure. The weight of her actions, and the mountain of evidence against her, had left her little room to argue. The proceedings moved quickly. Claire presented the evidence with precise, meticulous detail, the security footage, the financial records, the damning text messages. Together, they painted a picture of betrayal so undeniable that even the judge's questions were brief and direct. Grace tried to downplay her actions, but her excuses fell flat. Her lawyer's arguments for shared custody and alimony crumbled under the weight of Claire's calm yet unrelenting rebuttals. By the end of the hearing, the judge's ruling was clear and decisive. Daniel was awarded full custody of the children. Grace was granted limited, supervised visitation. Her request for alimony was denied. The overwhelming evidence of her betrayal left no grounds for financial support. When the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, it wasn't just a verdict. It was the closing of one chapter and the start of another. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel headed toward the hallway, his mind finally quiet. Grace caught up to him, her eyes red and swollen, her usual bravado gone. She hesitated, shifting nervously before speaking. "Please, Daniel," she began softly, her voice trembling with a mix of desperation and regret. "Let's not drag this out any longer. We can find a way to work through this." Daniel met her gaze, his expression steady, unmoved. He took a deep breath before answering, his words calm but firm. "You dragged it out," Daniel said, his tone steady but devoid of anger. "When you chose Eric over me and the kids, you made your choice, Grace. Now you'll have to live with it." Her face crumpled, but Daniel didn't linger. He had no interest in prolonging the conversation. For too long, her words had held power over him. Now, they were nothing more than hollow echoes of a life he was leaving behind. Meanwhile, Eric's downfall was swift and brutal. His wife, Michelle, wasted no time filing for divorce once she uncovered his infidelity. But unlike Daniel, Michelle discovered not only his betrayal with Grace but a string of other affairs. Fueled by anger and a fierce determination to hold him accountable, she exposed his misconduct at work, falsified expense reports, and inappropriate behavior with colleagues. The fallout was catastrophic. Eric lost his job, his reputation was destroyed, and his financial stability crumbled beneath him. The ripple effects of his and Grace's actions spread quickly, turning their story into a cautionary tale within their social circles. The life they had built on deception lay in ruins, leaving them to face the consequences of their choices alone. Grace's attempts to salvage her relationships with friends and family were met with cold indifference. Eric's former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his tarnished name. For Daniel, the aftermath was bittersweet. Winning custody of his children brought immense relief, a validation of his fight to protect them. He threw himself into creating a stable, loving home, focusing on their happiness and well-being. But despite his efforts, there was still an undeniable grief. The loss of the family he had once believed in and the betrayal by people he had trusted implicitly. Even in his grief, though, there was hope. Each day brought small victories. His children began to smile more, their laughter filling the house in ways it hadn't for months. The weight of uncertainty lifted as they adjusted to their new normal, finding comfort in Daniel's unwavering presence. Slowly but surely, the broken pieces of their lives started to fit together again. For Grace and Eric, the path forward was far more uncertain. The choices they had made had cost them everything: relationships, reputations, and the stability they had once taken for granted. Daniel didn't dwell on their misfortune. His focus was on the life he was rebuilding, one rooted in purpose, integrity, and the unwavering love of his children. The scars of betrayal remained, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as a testament to his resilience and the strength he had found in starting over. The months that followed became a time of quiet rebuilding for Daniel and his children. The wounds of the past lingered, but their home gradually became a place of warmth and laughter again. Daniel threw himself into fatherhood with all his heart, making sure his kids felt secure and loved. He attended every school event, coached their weekend soccer games, and carved out time for family movie nights, savoring the small joys that had once been overshadowed by his crumbling marriage. The shift in their household was palpable. The children's smiles grew wider, their laughter more frequent. Though they sometimes asked questions about Grace, Daniel answered them with honesty and compassion, always reminding them that their happiness and stability were his top priority. He wasn't just healing himself, he was helping his children heal, too. One afternoon, while picking up his youngest from an after-school art program, Daniel met Amelia. She had the kind of presence that radiated kindness, her warm smile immediately putting others at ease. She was the program's art teacher, her passion for creativity evident in every detail. The way Amelia spoke to the children was nothing short of remarkable, gentle yet engaging. Her words filled with genuine warmth. She introduced herself to Daniel with an easy confidence, and their first conversation felt light and effortless. Over time, their paths began to cross more often. Casual greetings evolved into meaningful chats, and before long, Daniel found himself anticipating their interactions. Amelia's presence was a soothing contrast to the chaos he had endured. She was grounded, compassionate, and refreshingly genuine. Their connection grew slowly, naturally. Neither of them seemed in a rush to define what felt so significant. Daniel admired Amelia's ability to connect with his children. Her patience and creativity made her an instant hit in their lives. She introduced them to backyard painting afternoons and crafting sessions on rainy weekends, filling their home with the hum of laughter and imagination. The kids adored her, and she became a steady, comforting presence in their family dynamic. Amelia, in turn, respected Daniel's need for space to work through his emotions. She listened without judgment and encouraged him in quiet yet meaningful ways, reminding him of his worth with her calm support. Their bond wasn't born out of necessity or loneliness. It was built on mutual respect and understanding. One evening, after a family dinner Amelia had helped prepare, Daniel found himself watching her as she laughed with the kids. She fit so seamlessly into their lives, as though she'd always belonged there. The scene filled him with a peace he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since his world had fallen apart, Daniel felt something unfamiliar: hope. Amelia wasn't just a source of love and support. She was a reminder that life could be rebuilt and happiness could bloom again. Together, they began to create a future rooted in trust, love, and the hard lessons learned from the past. In the quiet weeks after the court ruling, Daniel was visited by ghosts from his recent past. Grace was the first. She showed up unannounced at his doorstep one evening, her once sharp confidence replaced by a fragile, hollow demeanor. The children were upstairs, blissfully unaware of the conversation unfolding below. "I just need your forgiveness," Grace said, her voice trembling as she stood in the doorway. "Please, Daniel. I've lost everything. I'm trying to make things right." Daniel leaned against the doorframe, his expression calm but resolute. He studied her, as if weighing the sincerity of her words. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured and firm. "Forgiveness isn't something you demand, Grace," he said, meeting her gaze. "It's something you earn. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever be able to give it to you." Grace's face crumpled, but Daniel didn't waver. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," he continued, his voice steady. "I just need you to understand that some things can't be undone. I've moved on, Grace, and I think you should too." Her shoulders sagged as the weight of his words sank in. She nodded reluctantly, the finality in his tone leaving no room for argument. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the dim evening light. Daniel closed the door and stood there for a moment, exhaling deeply. The encounter stirred emotions he thought he'd put to rest. But as he let out a slow breath, he felt something else: relief. As Daniel turned away from the door, the sound of his children's laughter drifted down from upstairs. It grounded him, reminding him of what truly mattered. Grace no longer had any power over him, and that was a victory he would never relinquish. A week later, it was his mother who reached out, seeking her own absolution. Her message was tentative, laced with guilt and remorse. She invited him for coffee, her words careful and apologetic. Daniel agreed, not out of a desire to reconcile but out of curiosity. They met at a quiet cafe, where the air was thick with unspoken words. His mother sat across from him, hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I made a terrible mistake, Daniel. I thought I was protecting you by staying silent, by trying to hold everything together. But I see now that I only made things worse." Her voice cracked, and tears welled in her eyes. "I can't undo what I did, but I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." Daniel looked at her, emotions warring within him. He had loved and trusted his mother all his life, but her role in Grace's betrayal had left a wound that wasn't easy to heal. He sighed, his tone soft but firm. "I appreciate your honesty," he said, "but forgiveness, it's not something I can give right now. I need time, Mom. I need to figure out what our relationship looks like moving forward." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she whispered. I hope we can find our way back to each other someday." The conversation ended with a fragile, cautious hope. As Daniel drove home, he felt an unexpected sense of closure settling over him. The people who had hurt him most had sought his forgiveness, but he realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving them. It was about finding peace for himself, and that process couldn't be rushed or done on anyone else's terms. Healing was his journey, and he would take it at his own pace. When he arrived home, Amelia greeted him at the door with her warm, steady smile. Her presence grounded him, like a steadying anchor after rough waters. He joined his children at the dinner table, and as he listened to their chatter and laughter, he was reminded that his focus wasn't on the people who had broken his trust. It was on the ones who had earned it. The scars remained, but they no longer defined him. He had found his peace, and for the first time that was enough. Because of that peace, Daniel went through his workdays with a newfound sense of presence, appreciating the small, ordinary moments of life. The spring morning was warm and bright, the kind of day that felt like a promise of new beginnings. Daniel stood at the altar in a sunlit garden, surrounded by his children, close friends, and family. Amelia walked toward him, radiant in a simple white dress. Her smile was filled with the quiet assurance that had drawn him to her in the first place. The air hummed with joy and hope, a sharp contrast to the darkness he had once lived through. As their vows unfolded, Daniel knew that this wasn't just a new chapter. It was a whole new story, one filled with trust, love, and the strength that came from rebuilding after the storm. Daniel's heart swelled with a gratitude that felt impossible to put into words. Amelia wasn't just his partner. She was the embodiment of everything he thought he had lost. Her unwavering kindness, her patience with his children, and her belief in his strength had reignited something in him he thought was gone, the courage to trust again. As he slid the ring onto her finger, it wasn't just love that filled him. It was a sense of renewal, a feeling that he had finally found where he was always meant to be. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Daniel and Amelia sat together on a quiet bench beneath a canopy of softly glowing string lights. His children played nearby, their laughter rising and falling with the gentle evening breeze. Daniel turned to her, his voice thick with emotion. "I wouldn't have made it without you," he said, clasping her hand in his. Amelia smiled, her eyes warm and steady. "You just needed someone to remind you of who you are," she replied softly. "The rest was always in you." Her words settled deep in his chest, and for a moment, Daniel let himself reflect on the journey that had led him here. The betrayal that had once consumed him now felt like a distant memory, its sharp edges dulled by time and perspective. He realized that Grace and Eric's actions, though devastating, had been the catalyst for his transformation. Without their betrayal, he might never have found the strength to rebuild himself or the clarity to recognize the kind of love he truly deserved. As he watched Amelia laughing with his children, a thought struck him, one he had never fully understood until now. The best revenge wasn't seeing Grace and Eric struggle under the weight of their choices. It wasn't about bitterness or wishing them harm. The best revenge was living a life so full of love, joy, and purpose that their betrayal became irrelevant. It was choosing to rise above the pain and create something beautiful from the wreckage they had left behind. In that moment, Daniel felt a peace he hadn't believed was possible. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his, a life shaped by resilience, filled with people who mattered, and guided by a love that was real and enduring. As the night deepened and stars began to dot the sky, Daniel leaned back and looked upward, a quiet smile playing on his lips. The past no longer held power over him. The future stretched out before him like an open canvas. What had once been a story of heartbreak and betrayal had transformed into one of strength and renewal, a lesson he carried forward with quiet certainty. Sometimes the greatest pain leads to the greatest growth. And with that understanding, Daniel chose to leave the past behind and step fully into the life he had built. A life worth remembering not for its scars, but for the beauty that had grown from them. The weight of tragedy had been worn away by the steady lightness of day-by-day living. And that, Daniel realized, was the most remarkable part of it all.